Hello dear learners, welcome back to B.Ed Special Education approved by the Rehabilitation Council of India. I welcome you to the new course which we have started in the previous class, Inclusive Education. This is a 2 credits course and I am Dr. Tamil Selvan, Assistant Professor of Special Education, Tamil Nadu Open University. So in the previous class, we have started the course Inclusive Education, Unit 1, 1.1. Let us review what we have learned in the previous class. In the previous class, in 1.1, we have learned meaning and definition of marginalization and inclusion, causes and effects of marginalization, types of marginalization, and addressing the issues of marginalization in order to educate persons with disabilities in mainstream. Hope you all learnt all the above concepts well. Let us move on to topic 1.2, that is changing practices in education of children with disabilities. What are these changing practices? In this unit, segregation, integration and inclusion are the changing practices given. Look at the picture in the slide. This picture has 4 images depicting 4 scenarios or 4 practices in educating children with disabilities. You look at the image 1, which depicts exclusion. Exclusion is otherwise marginalization that we have discussed in the previous class. If you look at the image, you can understand whatever we learned in the previous class, that these people with disabilities are not included or not allowed in the mainstream, or they are not in contact with the typically developed peers or persons. All right, look at the second image. This image is a representation of segregation. This is also a practice. It is an old practice in educating children with disabilities. You can understand by looking at the object that here also children with disabilities are not allowed to be a part of the mainstream. But there is a change, there is a difference between exclusion and the segregation. If you closely look at the image, you can understand that here in segregation, the persons with the disabilities are grouped together for some reasons, maybe for education reason. But still, they are not a part of the mainstream. Let us look at the third image. You see, the third image represents the process or the practice called integration. Here also, if you keenly look at the image, you can see that the persons with the disabilities are grouped together, but they are a part of mainstream. But there is a difference between segregation and integration. In the segregation, they were outside the mainstream. But in the integration scenario, the persons with the disabilities are inside the mainstream, but there is a boundary. So this is a scenario of integration. Look at the last image. This image is a representation of inclusion. So inclusion is the present day practice of educating children with disabilities. So if you look at the image, you can understand that the persons with the disabilities are part of the mainstream. At the same time, they are allowed to mingle with the typically developed peers. So this is another important scenario of this practice. So we will one by one discuss in detail what is segregation, what is integration, what is inclusion. Let us discuss the practice segregation in detail now. In this slide also, the same image is given here for our understanding. But let us discuss what is happening in this practice. In this practice, children with disabilities are grouped together in order to educate them, but not as in the mainstream, but there is a special arrangement for them. This may be a special school or special class or home-based education. Here, the child's ability is important to plan education for them, because each person or a child with disabilities have their own ability. So, if we want to educate them properly, we need to understand their abilities first, so that we can plan education for them separately. And the education is limited to certain extent. What is that certain extent? Not as in the general or mainstream classroom. Here we plan the educational objectives according to their abilities. So, every teacher or every special educator will plan accordingly and fix a short term as well as long term goals in education. And mostly the education is designed to help them to live an independent life. So, most education for them is self-help based, and segregation practice is comparatively expensive than the other three practices, because here we have to establish a separate environment for them. If it is a special school or a special class or even the home based education, we need to spend and establish infrastructure as well as manpower as well as the evaluation patterns. Everything should be exclusively developed or established. So, the expense here is comparatively higher, and in this practice of segregation, the role of parents is very, very important. The special educator or a therapist or a trainer will instruct the parent to follow up all those things learned or taught in the daytime. So, the parents have to give a separate time to practice whatever has learnt in the daytime classroom. All right, this is a scenario of segregation. This has been followed from very long years. So, let us move on to the next stage of educating children with disabilities, that is integration. This is again a good effort of human beings to understand the educational needs and the social emotional needs of persons with disabilities. So, here if you look at the picture, the persons with disabilities are included in the mainstream, but not allowed to freely mingle with the peers. All right. Integration is again a good effort to educate them in the mainstream, but there are certain restrictions. One is, the persons with disabilities are merely admitted in the mainstream without establishing any special efforts like manpower, infrastructure and evaluation pattern separately designed for them, but they are in the mainstream setup. So, what is happening in the integration? So, in integration, we have started respecting their rights to education, but there were no proper or formal planning for them separately. But at the same time, if you look at the integration, there are resource rooms in the mainstream schools. There were a very few integrated schools. What happens in the integrated school? The persons with the disabilities, as usual, come to the mainstream school and they will attend the classes along with their typically developed peers. But after the class hours, they will move to the resource room. There will be some special educator or specially trained educator to help them with some assistive devices or technology in order to understand those subjects learnt during a day. This is an important move in the education system, and the resource room model was very successful also. But at the same time, if you look at the types of disabilities in a school, we may have in the very same class a student with visual impairment, even visual impairment, a completely visual impaired, partially visually impaired, and some other visual related problems. And there may be students with hearing impairment, again total hearing loss or hard of hearing. Even we may have children with hyperactivity, attention deficit hyperactive disorder, autism, learning disabilities, and so on. So, in this strategy or practice of integration, there were very less human power or trained educators appointed in resource room. So, it is very hard for the only one or two special educators to deal with all their educational needs every day. So, this had to be improved, and integration, the children with special needs were perceived as a problem, because to educate them we need a separate plan, we need a separate budget, we need separate infrastructure, we need additional manpower. So, because of these reasons, children with disabilities in integration were perceived as a problem. And the only important thing is, no special educators were in the mainstream class. So, with this knowledge, let us move on to the third practice, that is inclusion. Inclusion is the present day practice where we deeply respect their life of persons with disabilities, and we are trying to respect their rights also. So, if you look at the image, here persons with disabilities are freely mingled with other peers. So, what is inclusion? We have learnt in the previous class, it is the practice of including those who were excluded historically. So, we are trying to include those persons with disabilities in the mainstream education on par with the typically developed peers. So, this is a very important effort of human race in respecting persons with disabilities, and their rights. So, let us look at what is happening in inclusion. Inclusion is a formal part of mainstream. Now, it is a formal part, and all the children with disabilities are formally enrolled, not only enrolled, they are equally treated in the very same campus of any school or any educational system. And formal planning is also there for them in order to make them feel one among us, right? And this is a cost effective, comparatively cost effective practice of educating children with disabilities. Why? Because we need not construct or establish separate classrooms or separate school for them, because they are already in the mainstream classroom. And the government is trying to provide special training to the mainstream school teachers in special education. In this way, the same teacher, the one who is teaching science or mathematics, will deal the special children at the same time in the classroom. So, for human resource also we need not spend separately. Likewise, even in the teaching learning materials, those teachers had the experience or training in special education will be able to produce teaching learning materials according to the need of special education need children. So, it will be simultaneously useful for the typical peers as well as children with disabilities. So, in such a way, if you look at the whole process of inclusion or inclusive education, it is a cost benefit or cost effective practice among all of them. Okay. And here the important aspect of inclusion is it is learning centered. It is learning centered. Previously and all, if you look at the older practices, education was considered as teacher centered, and after a long time, education was considered as learner centered. Now, it is learning centered. The ultimate aim of education is make the learners learn irrespective of the difficulty of the lesson or the infrastructure of the school or institution. Our whole aim is to make the learners learn. So, inclusion is a wonderful process to educate children with disabilities in terms of learning centered education. And it is a holistic approach, because it not only takes care of the educational needs, but also when they are allowed to mingle with the typically developed peers, they will also understand the plus and minus of the particular disability, and the typical peers will learn how much these people with disabilities are abled. So, not only educational, but inclusive education gives strength to emotional as well as social bond. All right. The three important aspects of inclusion are, they say, accommodation, adaptation and modification. These are the three important aspects of inclusive education. All these three aspects will be explained in detail in the following lessons. So, we will stop here. This is a general introduction about these changing practices in educating children with disabilities. Let us summarize today's lesson. So, today we have learnt the changing practice segregation and its nature, The other changing practice, integration and its nature, and the final changing practice, inclusion and its nature. These are the references given to you. Whenever you find time, please refer to these books or the website, or you can scan the QR code to see a video on this topic. Thanks for patient listening. Thank you.